Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rational Female Podcast. And today we have on a new guest. His name is Omar, and he is a very interesting young man. So, we are going to talk all about the feminization of men and his experience of being a young male in the UK, and to what extent he thinks that feminism has had a negative effect on his experience as a man or the kind of overall young male Gen Z experience. So this should be a very interesting talk. Omar and I have collabed in the past on his channel, like quite a few years ago. And that was a very long video. It was a long time ago now, like I think 3 years ago. So yeah,
Maybe, yeah.
today it's going to be nice to just have him on. And I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. So, first of all, Omar, why don't you just introduce yourself and tell the audience a bit about yourself and your general work.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Omar, as you said. I'm 28. In terms of background, my grandparents are immigrants from Pakistan. They moved to the UK for economic reasons. My parents are both born in the UK. They went through the British school system and I've worked in the UK, and obviously the same with myself. And I have a YouTube channel also that, as you say, we collabed on a few years ago. And I've not been as active as I need to be, and so I'm trying to sort that out. But it's mostly like politics interviewing. It's more political based discussion, not really debate, but like maybe tough conversations with people and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so he talks more about geopolitical stuff. I obviously talk more gender political stuff, but we're both talking about tough topics. So, what I'd like to ask first of all is what is your overall experience of being a young man growing up in the UK? And I'd like to know specifically whether or not you would say that feminism has had a positive or negative impact on your life.
Okay, can you define kind of what you mean by feminism specifically there? Because
So, when I
my
say
my
feminism, gone.
yeah. Well, my initial thought is, growing up, I didn't really think about feminism. I probably didn't even know it existed. So I'm kind of looking retrospectively, and then it depends what exactly you mean by feminism.
So, do you think, for example, that there is an anti male culture in the UK? Do you think that women are kind of anti men? Do you think there's antagonism towards men? Do you think modern dating has gotten harder? Do you think that relationships between young men and women of our generation, Gen Z, has become a bit more challenging? Or do you think that actually it's not made much of a difference or an impact? And also, you can mention as well maybe things you might have seen on television, any films, any movies, any kind of media, social media, TikTok, Instagram. Have you seen anything out there that you would say presents a very kind of anti-male perspective? So my general view as well on this channel is the view that feminism is basically a form of misandry, and it creates victimhood in women. So it says to women that you're a victim of the patriarchy and that basically men are bad and women are innocent victims. That's what I basically talk about on the channel. I'm not against women voting. I'm not against women having careers. I'm not against women having any rights. I'm just against an ideology which I perceive as being very misandrous and tearing a wedge between the sexes. So I'm interested to know whether or not you feel that this has had any impact on your life as a young male, in your personal life, in your social life, in terms of the media. What have you seen, or if anything at all?
Okay, yeah, well, that's quite broad, right? So what I would say is it's kind of twofold. So as I said, I'm 28. The majority, let's say from I don't know, early years till maybe 16 to 18, maybe 20, is I feel where you're more susceptible to, what you take in. Maybe perhaps you don't, perhaps you're a bit more naive and a bit, you're quick to sort of take in stuff without challenging it. I feel that's generally a reasonable sort of assessment, yeah, or a state of things. And in those years, given I'm 28, I don't think there was a huge amount of, say, social media and TikTok and all of that back then, like 10 plus years ago. So in terms of my upbringing, it wasn't. I don't think I came across much as far as feminism and misandry and gender relations are concerned on social media growing up, because social media didn't really exist that much. I didn't come across it. I I don't. The short answer is I don't think it massively has, to be honest.
Okay.
And I think with social media being as vast as it is in terms of the content that's produced, as consumed as it is today, and over the last decade, let's say, I think there's so much talking over each other, talking past each other. This is why I asked you at the start, what exactly do you mean by feminism? Because depending on who I speak to, they sort of what they perceive it to mean or what they mean when they use the word, it differs. So in short, I'll say I haven't really felt any negative impact from feminism. However, when it comes to say relationships in terms of getting to know someone, marriage and whatnot, yeah, I have noticed over the last few years there is definitely well, maybe as I'm Muslim, so maybe this is a sort of subculture thing. Perhaps not actually, I think, right? But perhaps it is. I don't know. But there are massive expectations from males, of males, should I say, from women, and some of this is rooted in kind of the most kind of extreme side of feminism online. I would say, expecting a man to have tens of thousands of pounds and this and that, and that kind of thing. Yeah, okay. Hopefully that's
Okay,
sufficient
so
answer.
that's interesting then. So would you like to maybe give a bit more detail in terms of like expectations of males from women? Because I have heard that some men online now have been saying that women now expect a man who is very, very rich, who's very tall, who has a perfect body. And personally, I haven't had that experience. Most of the females that I know in my life are not looking for men who are really rich and ridiculously perfect looking, and I find that's really, really unrealistic and not really true. But perhaps you might be able to shed a different light on it. And it's very interesting you said that you feel that as a young Muslim man, there's a lot of like expectations on you as a man. So, if possible, would you be able to give some more detail into that?
Yeah, yeah. Just to clarify, I'm not saying this is a large pool of women.
Yeah.
It's just a few crazies. That's the way I feel it is. I
Okay.
haven't personally had that issue, but I've heard it from others, and
Okay.
you see it online. And this is another thing. It's very difficult, I've found, just in sitting around, thinking about things here and there, to discern what is online and what is real life, and how reflective these
Mm.
online videos are of real women in real life, and vice versa with men. But so in terms of like the only my only negative experience with quote unquote feminism has been actually mostly what I've heard from others, so it's not even a personal experience, but it's just kind of crazy expectations that some women have of men, in order to marry them, in order to be eligible for marriage. But I will reiterate, I haven't personally had that issue, and I I hope it's very few women and it's just kind of amplified online. I don't, you know what, I don't think it's anywhere near the majority or anything like that. So I don't really have a hugely negative thing to say, I guess, about feminism overall, in terms
No, but
of my experience and what I've heard, not necessarily of the ideology in and of itself.
I think that's good, though. I think it's good for people to hear that because it shows that it's actually not necessarily like in real life. It might not be that what we see on the internet is representative of like people's daily experience. So I actually think it's really good that you mentioned that. And I'm actually curious to know what you mean by women having crazy expectations. So do you mean in terms of money, or do you mean in terms of having a really expensive car?
Yeah, all the above, basically. Yeah,
Okay.
you know, uh, you need we have like dowry when it comes to getting married and stuff. So they might expect like 20K in cash, a car, you to own a house and stuff like that. And for the average guy, that's quite difficult, especially in your sort of mid 20s. As I say, I personally haven't come across that or had that experience, but I definitely have heard of it. So, I mean, it's just an example of where I think the question of feminism and how it affects men, where it's negative. Because I feel from what I've heard, the discourse that I've heard, these kind of few women I think have, it seems to be rooted in the idea of like girl boss and whatever, that kind of thing.
So is dowry, just to refresh my memory? I thought
Sure.
dowry was something that the woman's family give to the man family. That actually
I
doesn't make
think
sense.
the yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's the
Yeah,
other way
yeah, the
around.
word dowry is used. Maybe I've incorrectly used it, but I feel like it's used interchangeably with
Okay.
what's the word now?
Bride
There's I
price?
can't remember the word. Say it again?
Bride price? Maybe that's
Nah,
not the right.
definitely, it's definitely not right price. It's a gift. It's basically the female is allowed to ask for something, basically.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, because I don't know why I thought it was the woman's family, like the
I
woman's
think it
dad
is. Yeah,
gives
yeah.
money, but maybe that's an Indian because
It
your
is in
background.
other cultures.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm half Indian, so maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
but no, that's
I think
very
that
interesting.
is
Yeah.
the case. Yeah, in the I think maybe in Hinduism or something. I'm not 100% sure, but I have heard like Indian people mention that it's the husband's family gives it. But uh, the word slips my mind, but it's basically yeah, it's a gift from the man, and the woman has a right to accept whatever she wants. Or sorry, request whatever she wants.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you think that young men are becoming feminized? Have you witnessed any kind of feminization of men through media, legislation, or school programming, or would you say men are generally still quite masculine in terms of modern young men?
I think there's a huge mix of things going on. I don't think, I mean, I don't know of any stats, and I'm not even exactly sure how you would measure it. But you know, what would you describe as being more feminized? Can
So,
you
for
give an
example,
example?
men becoming a bit more overly sensitive, men not wanting to say take care of themselves emotionally, men kind of becoming very insecure, doubting themselves a lot, being very soft, being a bit overly feminine. So, I guess you think of like a traditionally masculine man as being someone who's very emotionally stable, who can provide, who can take care of himself, take care of his future family,
What do
who's
you mean by
kind of
take care?
well, I guess, financially, but also, I guess, so for example, if a woman and a man are in a relationship and the man just kind of breaks down and cries over something small, I personally would perceive that as a bit of feminine behavior. Like, I don't think, for example, it's bad for men to cry, say, at a funeral or if something's very serious or if he's like in physical, like serious physical pain. But I think that a lot of young women, like, I think that feminism kind of pushed men to become more overly sensitive and like emotional, but I actually don't think the average woman wants that. I think most women would prefer a man who is kind of more masculine, so can handle his emotions, pays for dates, well, initially anyway. I think after in a relationship, people might go 50-50, but it's kind of taking on the provider role. Like, we're going to decide we're going to go to this restaurant, we're going to this movie. I'm going to, I will decide, yes, I'll make you my girlfriend. Yes, I'll do this. Kind of takes charge, and the woman can kind of lean into that and be a bit more kind of just lean into that, be the kind of emotional kind of core, if that makes sense.
What's the connection with feminism and men becoming effeminate in the ways that you described? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Okay, so some have discussed that feminism has led to men losing their kind of traditional masculine behavior because it was kind of an attack on masculinity in men, and it kind of shamed and berated masculinity. It started saying that men who express masculine behavior, something as simple as like making crass jokes in the workplace because of the rise of HR, the rise of kind of I don't know, workplace harassment laws. So men weren't
What
allowed to
kind of
say
jokes? Okay.
like
I'm
crap.
trying to relate. Can I just
Sure,
say one
sure.
thing? Sorry to cut you off. I'm trying to understand what you're laying out here, and then apply that introspectively to my
Sure.
life, so I can give you an answer.
Absolutely.
So when you say, yeah, so if you just carry on, I just want to make clear why I'm asking
So,
you this.
yeah. So, for example, in the workplace, because the workplace was traditionally very male dominated, and yes, women have always worked, but they haven't necessarily works in like a male environment. They've done more feminine jobs such as nursing or textiles or teaching or education or psychology. Certain jobs, like for example, blue collar jobs, have been traditionally very, very masculine, like say plumbing or working with your hands, working in coal mines, or even like office jobs, which was obviously big, became more prevalent in the 20th century, there was a massive rise of women entering the workforce kind of from the 1960s onwards in the West. And that was largely, there were some reasons for that, like there was feminism, but it was also because of things like the modernization of the workplace, the kind of rise of just better working conditions overall, and also birth control, which was a massive, massive thing in like freeing up time for women to be able to, postpone children and go out to work, right? And there were more women going to university. So there's some debate among people who are critical of feminism that to what extent the rise of more women in the workplace is actually not necessarily a good thing, because you have, for example, HR, so human resources, so you have laws, like sexual harassment laws or workplace discrimination, and now we've got things like DEI. We've got these kind of laws which basically some might say have become like overly policing the workplace because females are generally more sensitive than males, and in terms of like more overly sensitive anyway, and women will kind of perceive things as being a bit more rude. So for example, things that men might find humorous, women may not find necessarily humorous. And because men have had to kind of walk around women's emotions and tiptoe around the way women feel, some men might perceive that as not liking it. Like they have to become a bit more kind of, oh, I have to be careful. I can't say this. I can't say that, which leads to a sense of insecurity, which actually leads to men becoming a bit more feminized because they can't just be that natural kind of, they can't be brash. They can't be crass. And obviously, I'm not saying people should be brash and crass all the time because that's rude, but the kind of masculine brashness and assertiveness and dominance and those kind of characteristics that women tend to find very attractive, they seem to be kind of lacking in modern men. And modern men now, in terms of like in their 20s and 30s, seem to have become a bit more nervous, a bit softer, more apologetic, because they're not allowed to express certain characteristics.
But everything you've just laid out there, you can make the same argument that in terms of race like relations the right word or not, I'm not sure, but prior to like HR and so on, in the workplace, it being a bit more regulated and employee having more rights, racial slurs were acceptable. People in lower positions. I'm giving an example of, stuff I've literally heard, for example, and some of it's a bit more crazy and some of it isn't. So, for example, you may well, even though it's not in your contract, you may well be expected to, if you're a new employee, let's say you've just graduated from uni, you're at, say, a construction firm or whatever, let's say it's office based, for example, you might be expected to go and do a tea run for people, go and fetch the tea for everyone, to do little bits and bobs of basically unpaid labor, stay around later than your contract even requires. But there aren't systems in place, there aren't laws in place that are there to counteract any sort of exploitation or abuse. The same with say racial comments. 50 years ago, for example, would I have as strong a case if someone called me a PAKI, for example, at work? Probably not. Now that's affecting me as a man. That hasn't anything to do with feminism and males and females. So, well, my immediate thought is, when you sort of laid out what you laid out there, is yes, more stringent regulation and a sort of stronger HR presence and whatever within the workplace has meant that men can't see as much as they want, perhaps, or they naturally would, let's say, whatever naturally means, or culturally would, right? Because you have to consider the other sex's feelings, and the other sex is more prevalent now, and in your workplace. But likewise, that same HR and much of that legislation is also protecting you from abuse from sort of degrees of power, those that you're working under, and also racism, disabilities, and so on. So
Yeah, right.
it's easy to just say feminism, but actually I don't think HR and this legislation is over feminism.
So
And
I would
DEI, I'm not sure how prevalent that is in the UK.
Yeah, no, DEI I think is more of an American thing. So I would actually argue that race and racism is not the same, because I generally argue that women as a collective group, I'm talking about women as a group, right? I would argue that women as a group have not faced discrimination in the way that like ethnic minorities have, because I would say we can say there's been genuine discrimination against African Americans. There's some genuine discrimination against people of different racial groups, right?
Are we
I don't
talking in
think
the UK specifically
I'm
here?
talking about
Just to
globe. I'm
clarify.
talking about all forever. I don't think
Okay.
that women have been a disadvantaged group in the way that people of color. I don't think it's comparable, because I think that women, if the other group, so African Americans, you have to compare it to say people who are not African American, right? With women, you have the other group, which is men. I think that men and women have actually had the same amount of difficulties historically. It's just that it's been different. And I think that feminism only looks at a politicized as the female perspective, but it doesn't look at the flip side, which is why I actually don't think it's accurate. So I actually don't think that we can say that women have been a collectively like singled out group, because the other comparison would be men. And I don't think that men have actually conspired to oppress women in the same way that, say, African Americans were actually oppressed by white Americans. I don't think it's the same. So I wouldn't compare women to race. I would say though that I don't think that having like a tote, because I do think as well it's good to have some laws or some rules against certain things. I just don't think that I'm in two minds about this also, because it's like there's one aspect of me which is like, yes, of course you want to have professionalism, but I also think that over policing things is dangerous. And I think that if you
Yeah, of
say
course. Yeah.
you can't say this, you can't say that, it does, it's not just workplace, but for example YouTube, for example, we're not allowed to use certain words on YouTube. We have to be very careful. And it's even gotten to a point now where, as you know, just before we started, right, I say this to everybody who comes on, don't say PORN, don't say RAPE. And I think it's just become a bit ridiculous. So there's,
Yeah, but that is a different argument to feminism, isn't it? Because you're
well,
showing that's basically like censorship to an extent, but like or control, or sort of authority governing things. Forcing sort of what we can and can't say. That's not limited to feminism and gender relations. And also, when you say historically, are we talking like the last 200 years or something, or like just to get a time?
I say overall, my framework is that men and women have both faced difficulties in different ways. And there's been times where women have held more power than men, and times when men have held more power than women. But I think that it all kind of evens out. I don't think that women as an entire collective have been oppressed uniquely in the way that feminists say, which is the argument that feminists make, which I think is it's too simplistic. I don't think it really
Mm.
makes sense to say women have been historically oppressed. I think women have faced hardships, absolutely. I just don't think that feminism was a good answer. I think that feminism kind of said, okay, yes, you have genuine grievances, but now what we're going to say is you're a victim and it's all men's fault, and that's the patriarchy. And I just think that's too, first of all, I think it's incredibly sexist. I also think it's too reductive. Sorry, just to dial back as well, regarding
Yeah,
the
sure.
censorship thing, I would say feminism is a large part of censorship. Of course, that's not limited to feminism. I think that's a broader problem of wokeism in general. But I don't think that I wouldn't say it's completely like can be detached. I would say feminism, censorship, PC culture, the rise of like sensitivity, even in like literature, sensitivity readers. I think feminism has played a massive role in this. And I actually think a big reason for this, because we were talking about feminization, is that because females we're more sensitive by nature. And actually, if you kind of create political legislation based on people's feelings, you end up with people being overly offended. And I think that's a big problem, actually. I think that's a problem of that's what happens with kind of the feminist aspect. It's like there's a positive side to it, which is, for example, things like human rights, or I don't know, I personally I support, say, gay rights, for example. I think gay people should have the right to get married. I think that's a positive thing. Then I think there's a negative aspect, which is, say, policing language, policing this, policing that. And I think that comes with kind of it's a feminization, because it's like this makes me offended, so don't say this. I hope that makes sense.
I'm not sure how you. It sounds like you're saying a lot of this is coming from feminism, which I just don't see that link. I think feminism has a part to play in it, but and has abused some of these systems and used some of these systems, but I don't think it all comes down to feminism. Um, yeah, I guess that's my thought really, and it there's a difficulty because not every minority has faced the same level of racism either. If you had a lot of money and came to the UK, for example, from my background, your experience is quite different to someone who came here, for money because they were sort of at the breadline, they needed to earn and to eat. So I do believe that women. Okay, what I'm just getting my thoughts together here, right? In tackling issues that we have as a society, there is a there is a need sometimes to use a general framework, i.e., um, all women, were unable to vote, for example. It's not like some could or some couldn't, say 200 years ago, right? So there we're talking all women. And when it comes to reversing something like that, women who back then who were married to wealthy men or nobles or whatever, obviously their experience was not the same as like the peasant, not peasants, not the right word, but lower working class, those who were married to the working class men. So yeah, there's a nuance between the types of women. But if you're going to deal with like a wider issue, a societal issue, sorry, you do have to use generality sometimes. Otherwise, we could break down the nuance so far because we can say black disabled women who are transgender. We can break this down so far and say, well, that a black disabled transgender woman is more oppressed, someone might argue, than a black disabled woman. But
Well, that's
when it comes
exactly
to
what intersectionality is doing, is trying to break things
yeah,
down. And I actually don't support that. Just about the vote as well. A lot of people don't know
yeah,
this. Most men 200 years ago couldn't vote either. It was only
okay,
wealthy men who could vote. And I think by the 1900s, more men could vote. Yes, I'm just talking about, say, in the UK and I guess in America. But voting, it wasn't specifically, because it's interesting you brought the point up about wealthy women versus poorer women. I would argue that a wealthy woman had more privilege than a poor woman, but also than a poor man, because a wealthy woman, if married to a rich man, I would say held a far more social privilege than most people. And most people, I mean, in the feudal era in Europe, for example, most people were peasants, most people lived in genuine hardship, most people were concerned with survival. And it wasn't like men were having a great time either. So I think feminism, yes, of course, all women in the 1800s couldn't vote in major elections. I think in some countries they could vote in local elections. I'd have to check the exact dates, but that's also because when a man voted as well, he would be taking into consideration his wife and his family. So it wasn't
you'd hope
like it was
so.
voting for my
There's
well,
nothing
generally
forcing him to do that.
generally speaking, because when a man and a woman got married legally, they were considered one person, and that's where you
Yeah,
have
but she
things like
was
okay,
considered his sovereign, right? If we're talking
well,
like the
it wasn't
1800s, early
necessarily that.
1800s.
It was more that when a man and woman got married, they were legally one person. That's how it was, at least in, I'd say, the West. I can't speak for other cultures. I only remember
Yeah,
the
sure.
bit about the West. But when a man and woman married, they were one person. So it wasn't like they weren't separate, if that makes sense. They were one legally one person. So it was like the one vote
Yeah,
was
but
for the for everybody.
they weren't equals though. When you say
Well,
the one vote was for both of them, it was cast, and the right was the husband had the right to the vote, and the husband also had a right to say her property and so on as well.
I mean, for example, if the man, I mean, you mentioned earlier about dowry. So,
Yeah,
in some cultures, a man had to pay dowry in order to marry a woman. There's also the case that if a man died, the woman would generally, be financially protected under alimony, I believe. And also, if a woman got into debt, her husband had to pay off her debts, so he was financially responsible for her. So what I'm basically saying is that the narrative is not quite so straightforward as women were oppressed. There's a lot more to kind of examine, and there's no accounting for male responsibility, male duty, male sacrifice. That's the general argument that I generally make.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
That sounds fair enough, but yeah, okay. I'm partly with you.
It's okay. I mean, a lot of people as well, because I have done a lot of reading. I've been talking about this for years. So I've done a lot of reading on this. I'm currently reading a really good book by a guy I have on regularly called Tim Goldich. It's called Loving Men, Respecting Women. And he actually starts off by talking about this kind of dynamic. And what he basically repeats constantly is that it all balances out. So the viewpoint is that it's not the feminist viewpoint is that women were victimized and men were kind of privileged. But what he says and what other people like, say, Paul Elam or Warren Farrell or Janice Fiamengo will argue is that actually it's not quite so simple. It's more that both men and women held certain difficulties and women had certain privileges that haven't always been necessarily accounted for by the kind of historians because of feminism, specifically second wave feminism, which is what most people now, I think, when they talk about feminism, they're generally talking about a second wave. They're talking about maybe because I think first wave is kind of detached a bit. A lot of people say first wave feminism because from like the 1960s onwards, that's when feminism became really, really pervasive in kind of mainstream modern culture. Okay, so let's shift now a little bit. So we've both seen the Louis Theroux documentary. I'd be very interested to hear your general thoughts on the manosphere, if any at all. So what do you think about the manosphere? What do you think about, I guess you could say, red pill ideology? Do you have any thoughts on the manosphere? Because I think the manosphere is perceived quite negatively, and I would say I don't agree with a lot of what is said. I don't like manosphere ideals. I don't think it presents a very balanced or positive view at all of kind of anti-feminism or that. I think it's extremely materialistic. I think it's very superficial. I think it kind of glorifies OnlyFans. I think it glorifies, pyramid schemes. I think it's incredibly. I just think it's vile, really. So, do you have any thoughts yourself on the manosphere?
Yeah, I would say everything you've said really I agree with. I'm not sure that it glorifies OnlyFans. I'm not. I thought they
No, maybe
mock
that's the
women
wrong
who do
word.
it.
Because I think I'm just thinking about the documentary. There was a guy who's like like the women. Some of them were on OnlyFans, and they say
Was he
like
praising that or mocking them? Don't they usually mock them? I think.
no, I think it's the women like in the kind of the videos you see them. They're like all on OnlyFans, and yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just the wrong thing to say,
Yeah,
but
yeah. No, yeah. As I say, I watched that documentary as we spoke about before this, whenever it came out, maybe like a month or so ago, and I think, yeah, my overall view of the manosphere, as far as I understand it is a lot of crap, most of it, and it's just kind of exploiting naive and susceptible sort of people, you know. It's just young guys kind of they're told like a half truth and they really buy into it. As I was saying earlier, you know, when you're younger, you you are more easily bought into things, if that makes sense. I'm not sure the right wording.
yeah, yeah,
And so maybe there probably is a lack of say of decent sort of role models and that kind of thing, and you see these guys with money, with cars, with women, and you think, wow, yeah, that this is how they're doing it. They're saying a few sentences that kind of make sense, you know, but a load of BS along with it. But you may be a bit naive and you only hear those few sentences and that's enough to hook you in. So I think it's exploiting young people, it's corrupting young people, and I think like say someone like you know, the two brothers that shall not be mentioned. I think these guys probably don't believe a lot of what they're saying. They just, there's a market there for it. I can't imagine if either of them are married. I don't know much about them, but if
No.
either of them are married, I can't imagine they treat their actual wife like they sort of
No, the Tate brothers are
portray
not
they
married.
would.
There was a lady named Brianna Stern I read about last year, I think, and she was basically the only woman who's actually like come forward vocally in terms of giving her name and face, and she talks about how she was like severely abused by Andrew Tate. But yeah, no, I mean I agree, and I also wanted to ask, do you think then that the manosphere overall is harming and having a negative effect on young men?
Yeah, yeah. How can there be any doubt about something like that? I don't know. I'd like to hear. I don't. It sounds like you don't.
Yeah,
You agree. But I'd
I
like to
do
hear
agree.
who
Yeah,
thinks there isn't. Yeah. It's.
yeah,
You can say shit, right? Pretty sure. I can say
sure.
that, right?
So
It's okay. I'll
then,
say crap. It's a load of crap. I'm just saying it's a load of crap, and it's. I don't have the words to express how full of crap it is. To be honest.
yeah,
It's just so ridiculous. It's full of rubbish. You have a conversation with one of these guys beyond like 2 or 3 minutes, not even that, a 2 or 3 sentence soundbite. There is not much behind it, but there's a young, susceptible market for it, and these young guys are victims of it. Many of them, I feel.
okay. So then, so you mentioned something which would be good to discuss as well. So, do you think there's been a loss of traditionally masculine male role models? And do you think that this has actually contributed to the rise of the manosphere? Because, for example, I generally, I would say, just for the record, that I think a lot of the problems caused by the manosphere actually trace back to feminism. I think feminism has contributed to this because of the kind of radical misandry. So that's my view. But I also would like to know whether you think that because there aren't many good male role models, and we've got people like the Tate brothers who, obviously became very famous a few years ago, and now they've, kind of died down a bit. But yeah, do you think then that the lack of traditionally masculine role models has led to young men kind of being very, sucked into these kind of such and such people like Sullivan or what's his face, Waller or whatever?
I don't know who those guys are, but
No,
maybe
from
Sullivan,
the
maybe.
documentary like H. Sullivan and
Oh,
Justin
okay, I
Waller.
can't remember.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Oh, is that the guy who was like married and
Justin Waller. Yeah, he wasn't even legally married, but they practiced one-sided monogamy and
his wife was on there as well? Yeah, okay, yeah, I got you.
yeah.
Um, this is where I would differ with you personally, right? If I can
Okay,
answer the question like this, I personally don't feel that feminism is at the core, is the root of this.
okay.
It's obviously a contributor, and I'm not learned enough to lay out exactly what percentage it contributes or exactly how these things are intertwined. But I think a lot of this is based on financial circumstances. I think if people weren't struggling financially as much as they are generally, and people had more of a sense of security in that sense, and also what there's also an intertwining with culture and with like I mean growing up again, myself in the UK in a working class culture that is not like middle class or anything.
Mhm.
There was a lot of like materialism and that kind of thing, looking up to like brands and cars and this kind of thing. And this manosphere, what you see a lot in that documentary is cars, watches. A lot of money is being flashed. The money is very much a part of it. As much, it's masculinity and money are like inseparable in the manosphere, if you will. That's my like impression. And so I think if and people are struggling, and they buy into this crap. I'm not sure if that's answered your question or not. can't even remember what your question was. Maybe
No,
got
that's great.
got
It's
a bit
kind of like
skewed, but
because you're generally saying then that this kind of discounts the average man, which you touched on a bit earlier. That the average man, of course, is not incredibly wealthy, and it's kind of like the manosphere is, shitting on people who don't have lots and lots of money because it is glorifying being very, very rich. Is that what you're
it's
saying?
reinforcing the negative sense of security that they have. It's reinforcing the thought of I need to perform at this level, I need this, I need that. And those who are struggling financially, obviously they need to, by whatever legal means. Well, I think there's a problem of corruption, in terms of money and stuff throughout the world, really. But I think if people's baseline was met and they weren't struggling financially, they had a house, a secure job, they had a vehicle, food, they weren't struggling for these things. I think they would be less susceptible to the messaging that comes out of this manosphere type crap.
Yeah, no, that's
So
a
it's
great answer.
exploiting vulnerables. That's what I think. And what's come from a mesh of all of this stuff is also what I was saying earlier, like this subculture of like materialism and having to have the next best flashy thing and all of that. It's all mixed, a whole load of crap mixed together, and it really messes with a young person's head, I think.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
So, what do you have any comments then on the growing rise of poor male mental health? Because mental health in young men is another big topic, and obviously, mental health in women is terrible too, obviously, and I can personally attest to that. But there's a big discussion now online. So, Roma Army is kind of the leading female MRA on the internet, and she talks a lot about men's mental health, men unaliving themselves, and I'd like to know if you have any thoughts because you touched on obviously financial expectations. Do you have any thoughts about the growing rise of poor male mental health?
I don't know the stats. This isn't like something that I have looked into much, so I'm just giving layman general sort of the context I've presented of myself and just giving my general thoughts based on what I've heard and seen. I wonder how much of this increase in men's mental health is, if this is what someone was to claim, right? I wonder how much of that is catching up of stats. I don't know how. If you go back a number of decades, probably the further you go back, I don't know, within 100 or so years or something. I don't think it would be. It probably wasn't. Let's say 20 years ago compared to today. Yeah, it probably wasn't as societally acceptable for a man to say he feels like he's struggling, to cry and stuff like you were saying. So even though perhaps they did feel that way, it was like suppressed and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure how much of this is just stats catching up to what was already the case back then. I don't know. It's like an open question. Maybe someone has an answer to it. And again, without seeing stats and really being in the know, I think not everyone, I think people are struggling across the board. Like there's a loneliness epidemic for men. I think women probably have a kind of similar experience. So again, I'm not sure where the balance is between the two, but I've heard of plenty of men and plenty of women who are really struggling. And I'm not sure how much pitting these things against each other is useful either. Yeah, I
Yeah.
understand if it's a much wider problem for one and versus the other, that you might be making this argument or having this discourse in order to try and push funding more for one than the other because it's much more impactful or whatever. There are more vulnerables in one category than the other. I don't know what the idea there is. Uh, I feel like everyone's suffering, man, in some degree, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure if one is necessarily more than the other. And I feel a lot of it again comes back down to like socio-economic circumstances. A wealthy
Okay.
man in the UK is probably in a better mental space if he's not a victim of all this materialist crap online, having to keep up a lifestyle. he's probably in a better mental state than a girl, a young woman living on a council estate, for example.
Of course, of course. So you mentioned the loneliness epidemic among men. What do you think then is the cause of that? Do you think again this is just something that's affecting everybody, or do you think specifically, as in among men, do you think that this could be tied to pressure, financial pressure, media pressure? Yeah,
Well, I use a phrase loneliness epidemic with men because I've heard it a lot, and just
yeah.
in terms of in my answer there. But are women thriving in that regard, or is there a big difference between men and women? Would you say
In what
in terms of
sense?
loneliness and this kind of thing?
No, I agree. I mean, it's interesting you say that because I guess because I'm constantly talking to people and they obviously mainly they focus on men. And I think the reason for that is because there seems to be a consensus that because feminism is such a global presence, we seem to focus more on issues facing women and sort of not prioritize as much issues facing men. And I would like to see, I would like no feminism, and I definitely would not call myself an MRA either. I would like a gender equalism where we give equal amount of weighting to male issues and to female issues. So, for example, we should tackle the problem of female genital mutilation. We should also tackle the problem of male genital mutilation. I'm not sure what your thoughts on that. If you want to give any thoughts on that, I don't know if circumcision is practiced in
Yeah,
the
going
UK.
wide, going into this is if we could stick to say the UK, otherwise I'm not I don't think I'm
That's
capable beyond that. Yeah, male circumcision is considered a rewarding thing in Islam.
a rite of passage.
As
Yeah.
is the opinion that I've heard and follow or whatever, I'm sure there are varying opinions. Um, the whole female thing is mad. I don't know where the hell they get that from. And it seems to be maybe a bit more of a cultural thing in specific regions, maybe. But I don't know a lot about this stuff, and I have a better understanding of things in the UK. Maybe that's why I've tried to give my answers in that regard, or in that sphere. Um, yeah, sorry, what was the question?
Well, I guess also, for example, so obviously the loneliness epidemic, or even something like domestic violence. I think that the way I see it, we often see it as framed as violence against women and girls, which obviously on the one hand is good. We should absolutely take that seriously. However, I'm concerned that we neglect violence against men and boys, and we neglect violence against males. A lot of men experience domestic violence. They tend to experience more psychological abuse as well. I have read various studies, and I generally, from what I've read overall, it seems the women commit as much domestic violence as men do. It's just that women tend to use objects more, whereas men obviously physically stronger. So men use their fists, whereas women will use a pan or a knife. And I have read as well that lesbians, in terms of the rates, it's disproportionate. So lesbians actually have a disproportionately higher rate of domestic violence compared to other groups. So it's actually lesbian women and bisexual women that report the highest levels of domestic abuse. I think with gay men, it's the lowest. Um, yeah, we need to double check on that, but yeah, I think it's the lowest in gay men. And I wonder as well. So I agree in a sense that yes, we should take everyone into consideration, which is my personal problem with feminism. I think that it actually doesn't help to say violence against women. We should say violence against men and women, violence against people, both males and females. And I think that we should be looking at, because as well, even men's mental health, it should be men's and women's mental health, really. I guess also because men and women are different biologically, I would argue anyway. So we have to look at we behave differently and we have different needs. I don't think we can treat women like men, and I don't think we can treat men like women. I think some things women are better at, some things men are better at. On average, I'm not. There are obviously outliers. Like for example, they say men are more interested in things, women are more interested in people, men are more solution oriented, women prefer to talk for the sake of, women tend to bond through conversation. A lot of female friendships is based around just talking and just, but that's how women let off steam. Whereas men, it's maybe based more on doing, like you might play video games together or go and have beers. I don't know, but but yeah. So I think that it's important to actually respect the natural differences between men and women. I think we're socialized differently because we are different. I don't think it's because society necessarily says men behave like this, women behave like that. Yes, you can argue there is that to some extent, but there's a reason for that. And, I've read several books on the differences between male and female brains. There's kind of a funny book called Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps. It's kind of a humorous book, but there's a neurological difference in how males and females think and behave. And I think when we negate that and ignore that, what we're actually doing is making it's much harder for women and men to relate to each other, to have stable relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, who's negating or ignoring that if we're talking about you know violence against women and girls? Where is that being negated or
I would
ignored? The
say that
difference?
feminists are negating violence against men and boys. I would say that a big part of feminism is saying that gender is a social construct. Obviously, this does depend on which aspects of feminism. Like now, it's largely intersectional feminists that argue that gender is socially constructed and there's no
That's
difference
not the
between women.
majority, is it? Usually, if you
Well,
bump into someone,
intersectional feminism is
maybe,
quite a large part of feminism. That
yeah,
viewpoint was largely pushed in the kind of second and third wave. So, for example,
mm,
people like Judith Butler or Kate
yeah,
Millett. But the idea of gender as a social construct has kind of led to like the modern kind of gender fluidity ideology, and
mm.
that is a kind of big problem. So, yeah, it's only really radical feminists who generally argue seem to now be pushing the idea that gender is biological, like Kathleen Stock and that. But then the majority of feminists, I say, are intersectional feminists. Sorry, one.
But the majority of people would probably, I agree with, you know, like equality between the two sexes, as opposed to this sort of newer iteration of feminism, right? That's intersectionality and gender and whatever. You know,
I would say, well, I've read a YouGov poll saying that I think it's like 83% of people in the UK support gender equality, but only 35% identify as feminists. So I would say the majority of people have the view that men and women deserve equal rights, and I am absolutely for that. But I think, and I would call that gender equalism in the sense that men and women are different in nature, but equal in value. I think that feminism says that if it promotes victimhood, it promotes female supremacy, in my view. It also promotes misandry. I think it drives a wedge between males and females because it argues that women and men women are inferior to women have always been seen as inferior to men. I think it just takes a reductive, politicized viewpoint of gender, and I don't like that. So that's why my work here is all about challenging that.
yeah, yeah. Okay, just on some of what you've said. So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you have an issue with. Well, okay, let me reword this. You know the Black Lives Matter movement. Let's just put the corruption aside, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just as like a principle stance or whatever, right? There was the whole like Black Lives Matter, and then there was a kind of All Lives Matter, maybe
Yeah.
response to it as well. We putting the corruption of the actual movement aside, right? The idea behind Black Lives Matter was that whether it's true or not, whatever, there was an institutional and historical injustice against black people in the US specifically, right? Specifically males and police violence and that kind of thing, right? That was their like generalized the core of what they were saying. That's correct, I think, yeah.
So again, I wouldn't personally compare the state of women to the state of African Americans. And if I'm going to be blunt and
I'm
brutally
not
honest,
comparing them.
I
I'm
would
just
lean.
trying to
I know
establish a
you're not. I'm
principle.
just saying, yeah. I would probably lean, if I'm being blunt, I would lean more towards being on the All Lives Matter side because I'm not sure Black Lives Matter is helpful. It's very difficult also for me to comment on that because I haven't really experienced racism. I'm from London. I come from a very diverse family. I've always had lots of different ethnic groups of people around me.
I
So
haven't
I don't know.
experienced
Yeah.
I haven't experienced, violence against women, but I can comment on it.
Of course, yeah. So I would probably lean to more towards all lives matter because I'm not sure I find Black Lives Matter helpful. I'm not even sure Black Lives Matter has done black people much good in general. I
I'm
think
not
that
asking any of that though. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm
it's
just trying
okay.
to establish if there is let I'm saying corruption and all of that aside. If there was an institutional problem specifically with black men being treated um, in a more negative way for whatever reason, is there is calling that out specifically, is that taking away from other issues?
Well, I
Like,
think the issue is not because I've read the stats on that, and actually,
no,
it's
I'm saying
men
if there
in
was though.
general.
I'm
Well,
saying if there
I think
was.
well, if there was, but okay, I'm not sure. Well, okay, so I would say there was an institutional problem against African Americans in the 20th century. I think only a nut job would say that wasn't the case. And that's where you had the Black Panthers, people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, who did a lot of good work. I don't think that in the 21st century it's even comparable. Now, having
I'm not
said that,
saying. Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
an African American. I don't
Okay.
think the UK is anywhere. I don't think the UK is a racist country. I've heard actually African American people talk about racism. It's very, very hard for me to comment on something I don't know what to say on. I will say though, I think, having looked at the data, that men in general are more likely to be murdered by police. And I think that I'm not sure it's helpful to frame it as it's a black thing as opposed to just police in America in general being brutal. Like, I think police brutality is awful, and I've heard some non-black Americans, so not necessarily just white, but just other Americans say that there's a general issue with police in America with them abusing their power, and that Black Lives Matter kind of turns it into a race argument when actually the problem is American police in general. I've heard
Okay,
that
but
viewpoint, but I don't know what to say on that
what
much.
what I'm trying to say here is if there was if there was a specific issue and it wasn't just general police violence, if it was exacerbated when it came to black people, I'm saying likewise, if there is more domestic violence towards women and girls, if this is more prevalent than the other, it's almost like an epidemic, right? If that's what the stats point to, because that's what someone who is very firm on these things will say. You can argue the stats. That's not the point I'm making. I'm saying if they say, as far as they understand, the stats point to black men being brutalized much more proportionally than white men, and if in the US in that example, and if women in the UK, for example, or wherever, say actually statistically women are the victims of violence, domestic violence, much more than men. What I'm asking you is if the stats do stand in their case, are correct in those two instances, is there an issue with saying Black Lives Matter and taking that kind of stance in that
Well,
moment
the
in time when
problem
the
is,
stats point
but
that way? Can I just 2 seconds? Sorry, I know it's quite long what I'm saying, but just so I can explain what I'm saying correctly, and likewise with saying a big push on um, in tackling domestic violence against women and girls, right? If the stats are as they say, as they proclaim they are, is there an issue with using such language and pushing your movement in that way? It sounds like you're disputing the stats, which is a
well,
different discussion.
the thing is, if there was,
Yeah.
absolutely. The problem is there is not. What I'm
Okay,
saying
but
is
that's a
that
different argument. But that's a different
well,
argument then.
yeah, the argument I'm making is actually there is not women first of all, disproportionately women are more likely to be abused by other women, and in terms of lesbians, and if you actually look at
Okay, but how
actually
many people are
domestic violence
lesbians?
abuses, well, that's what I'm saying, is disproportionate, right? In the sense that there's less
Yeah.
lesbians, yet they're committing more domestic violence. I have also seen as well, some Americans have said that there's less black people in the USA, black males specifically, but they commit more of the crimes. I don't know exactly that, so I'm not going to comment too much. But I would say that yes, of course, if women as a whole were actually more abused than men, of course, then we need to give that our attention. But that's not the case. And Erin Pitsey was a lady, a very well known lady who worked, she opened the first domestic violence shelter in London. And she found that actually, when she looked at it on an overall scale, men and women experience the same amount of domestic violence. And actually, it tends to run more in families. So she described it as a family issue and an intergenerational issue, not a women issue. And I think the problem is that we are so used to thinking of domestic violence as something that seems to specifically be men attacking women. We don't seem to think it's a bit like, I guess, infidelity. Like we tend to assume that men are the ones who are unfaithful, even me. But actually, women are unfaithful. And I've been thinking a lot about this actually. Women are probably just as unfaithful as men. They probably just have different motivations. We probably don't hear about it as much. It's probably not as talked about. You know, like I reckon infidelity is probably not that far off. It probably, I would need to check that specifically, but it's likely that infidelity we associated with men cheating on their wives because obviously men have higher sex drives, but women have their own reasons for cheating. Sometimes it can be for revenge, sometimes it can be for emotional reasons, sometimes it can be for manipulation. So yeah, I think that I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but yeah, no, I don't think
No,
it's
it's okay.
it's correct to say that domestic violence is an exclusive thing that only affects girls and women. Not that you were saying that.
Yeah, so you're arguing the stats.
No, I'm arguing that the stats say men and women experience roughly an equal amount of domestic abuse. And I can send you information on that afterwards if you're interested.
Yeah, sure. But what I'm saying is, you're saying because the stats, as you say, indicate that it's equal. Thus, we should, if we're speaking about domestic violence, we should speak about it equally in terms of male and female, right?
Absolutely.
Victims.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. So we've come. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Well, there's probably loads. I feel like we could go on for a while, but it's a minor point. But I would also say, if it was equal, if this was the case, right? That's not my perception, but anything I say is kind of speculation because I haven't looked into any sort of stats. What I would say is men are usually more physically stronger also. So even if there was an equal amount of violence from one to the other on the whole, you would find that in terms of the physical abuse, if you could measure it, taken, you're probably going to find that women end up worse off, even if an equal amount of them are, doing the reverse. Do you know what I'm saying? If
Well,
you
what I
punch
said
me and I
earlier
punch
is that
you,
men
yeah,
are bigger than women, yes, but women tend to
yeah,
use objects more. So women tend to
okay.
use physical items into commit to abuse.
And they
There's also
probably can't throw them as hard as men. If we're going
well,
to say,
that's
if
not
we're going to
really
say
the
men are
point, because
physically
also
stronger,
most
yeah,
men on principle do not actually want to physically harm a woman. So most men, if their girlfriend or wife is throwing something at them, most
yeah.
men are not going to hit back. Most men actually don't physically abuse women. It's a
And it's
minority
not the
of
same
men
in
that actually.
reverse. Well, it's not the same in
Oh,
reverse.
of course, absolutely. No, I'm not. I'm not arguing that most women abuse men. I'm saying that a minority of people commit domestic violence. It's not most people, and
Yeah, yeah, I hope so.
in those cases, it's actually lesbians disproportionately who commit more domestic violence, and it's overall, I would say it evens out if you look at the spectrum. Erin Pitsey, there's a well-known study from Gels and Strauss which found that it was again about 50%. I can send you the information on this afterwards if you're
Sure,
more
yeah.
interested. Anyway, we've come to the end of the stream now. So yeah, I very much enjoyed our discussion, and
Yeah,
we can always
likewise, yeah.
speak again in future if you have more questions. But thank you everyone for tuning in today. This is a very, very interesting, intelligent man. Please let me know, Omar, if you have any closing thoughts or anything.
Uh, I I've become a bit disenfranchised with like society as a whole in the UK recently. Just with the amount of, there's just so much going on, it seems, online anyway, and it's hard to understand, as I said earlier, how much of this is online and how much of it is real life. And I feel wherever you stand politically, religiously, any I've generally felt that if people sit down and have an honest conversation, just face to face, politely, people agree on most things. And I think there is a lot being stirred up by, agitators with control and power. And I think there are masses of people, I'm talking the UK specifically here, who are, as I said earlier, again, struggling, they're kind of finding life tough and whatever, and maybe they're being pushed in a certain direction. And I think that's across race, religion, loads of different issues and areas, and some of them we've discussed here. And just try. I hope that I do it myself, and I hope that others sit back and think about things maybe like more open-mindedly and really, before labeling and that kind of thing. And I think people can get on, man. I think we're all being kind of used, unfortunately, a little bit.
Okay,
And
excellent.
check out my channel if you want.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, his channel link is in the description box. So, yeah, I don't have the link, but it's in the description. So his full channel name is Omar. It's Omar Ali, right?
Yeah, OmarAliyt. I think that's it.
Yeah,
Something like that.
Omar Ali YouTube. Cool. Brilliant. So thank you everyone for tuning in. And yeah, we may have this we may chat again in the future for sure. This has been really, really interesting, really great. Thanks everyone for listening. So I will be live again on Tuesday the 23rd, and that should be a lot of fun. So stay tuned. And until then, this is the Rational Female. Goodbye, people. Thank you.